Hello, everyone. It's 11 o'clock, 27th of February. Finally, the day has come. We start our conference called Those Who Live and Those Who Stay, a title inspired slightly by Elena Ferrante, The Consequences of Emigration for Standing Countries. And thank you all for coming. We will have 2 days of very diverse panels and presentations. Maybe before we start, I should just give a very brief presentation of who I am and of CRASSH, the center that organizes this conference. But before that, I would like to really thank Nikki Davidovsky, our conference and event manager, who basically made this possible. CRASSH is the Center for Research in Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. Last year, in 2021, we celebrated 20 years since its foundation. It's a very interdisciplinary center in which we study all kinds of topics. Actually, I work currently on a project that is more related to digital media and finding alternatives to the current digital monopolies. And it was actually the intersection between my interest in digital media and emigration that brought me to this topic. So with several colleagues from Eastern Europe, we studied how emigration affects protest participation and how media are used basically to reconfigure how we understand participation. And from then, with another team of colleagues based in the University of Milan, the University of Dresden, and the University of Oslo, we started developing a program for studying the politicization of emigration in particular. And basically out of this research, the idea for this conference sprung up. So it's part of a broader, I think, common effort of several scholars across Europe to think of emigration explicitly. And our argument has been very simple, that at least within Europe, quite often people have focused on immigration. Most academic research and most academic funding goes in this direction. But we know much less about the consequences of emigration for the standing countries. I'm Eastern European. As I mentioned to Nikki before we started, I'm Bulgarian, Russian, and Latvian, so 3 countries that have been quite affected by emigration. And I have experienced purely biographically, I think, the consequences of leaving and staying and leaving again, so complex mobilities on personal life, on my individual trajectory, but also if we think on a global plan or like on a more big scale plan, the consequences of emigration for the pension system, for example, the consequences of emigration for social care and the fabric of society. And the consequences of emigration, of course, for political participation, the topic I'm personally most interested in. And so in a series of different conversations, we realized that actually these are topics that scholars from other parts of the world have long thought of and written about. And we decided to organize this event to basically bring together these different perspectives to discuss basically a topic we thought is largely overlooked so far. And it is what are the consequences of emigration for those who stay? What are they also for those who leave? Do they relate with the countries they live, or do they try to completely integrate in the new countries? And yeah, that's basically, I think, the broadest context of the conference. We have 2 days of very exciting papers, and I think it will be really a great event. As I mentioned to Professor Robertson, whom I'm going to present in a second, we are thinking also of publishing, ideally a special issue, or most probably 2 special issues from the conference, since the topics are quite diverse. And so most probably one will have to do more with the political economy and sociology side, and the other more with the art perspective on emigration and its consequences. Without further ado, maybe I actually first should just give some administrative information. We are going to record the keynote speeches. So today's speech by Professor Susan Robertson, and tomorrow's keynote by Olga Onuch from the University of Manchester. Otherwise, we will not record because we decided it will be more informal. So we will keep just the keynotes as a video memory from the conference. We will tweet about the event on @CRASSHLive. I will share the handle in a second. And yes, feel free to write questions on the chat, write any opinion, thought that comes to your mind. And that's it. I think there is no further administrative information I should convey. Am I right, Nikki? Is there something else that I should say in advance?
No, that's everything.
Perfect. Okay, I'm happy. I was slightly panicking. Yes, and now I would like to present Professor Susan Robertson, who is an emeritus professor of education at the University of Cambridge, Department of Sociology. Her research draws upon an explicit interdisciplinary approach to research on education, particularly politics, geography, sociology, and anthropology. And these different disciplinary ways of looking at the world basically help us understand education in more complex ways. Professor Robertson is the founding director of the Center for Globalization, Education and Societies at the University of Bristol, and founding co-editor with Roger Dale of the journal Globalization, Societies and Education. She has worked with numerous other colleagues, including Chris Oates from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, around many of these issues. And she also is involved in a blog called Global Higher Education, Global Higher Ed, which keeps us briefed on developments in that sector. This presentation was actually taken from her blog, so if anything has changed, meanwhile, Professor Robertson, you're very welcome to correct me and provide more updated information. And as I mentioned before we started, I think we would all be interested also to hear a bit more about the journal and your work. But maybe let's begin with the keynote, and we will have, I think, quite a few minutes for questions and answers afterwards. The keynote will be around 30-35 minutes, and please, everyone, feel free to post questions in the chat, to raise your hand afterwards. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much, Professor Robertson. The floor is yours.
So thank you so much, Julie, and also Nikki, and both for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak with you today. It's a fabulous program, and I wish you all well in the 2 days of your meetings, discussions, and so on. And just as Julia said, it's interesting, I'm not an emeritus professor, and I'm actually a very good example of someone who's been to a large extent through their academic career mobile. I remember when I first went to take up an academic post in New Zealand and at the University of Auckland, and a colleague there when I arrived said, "What does it feel like to be an immigrant?" And I looked at them and I was kind of quite shocked. But of course, I have been an immigrant through my academic life. And in June, I actually leave the University of Cambridge to take up a new post at the University of Monash. So I will be leaving the United Kingdom and moving and hopefully moving, because of course getting into Australia, and I'll reflect on issues surrounding movement and so on, is somewhat more problematic now. Had I kind of been determined to make my way to where my mother lives in Western Australia, I would actually find it impossible to get into the state. No one's coming in, no one's leaving. And I think that raises some very interesting questions for us as we think about who's staying, who's leaving, who's actually forced to now remain when perhaps life and commitments and so on for families are somewhat now kind of distanced. So the broad title that I want to speak to today is called Critical Reflections on more or less international mobilities. And I'll be reflecting to some extent on the academy, but the academy itself actually has a whole range of other workers, not just academics, not just students. There'll be potentially domestic workers, for example. If you happen to be an academic in Hong Kong, domestic workers might have moved. There's actually a special line going into the airport in Hong Kong for domestic workers, particularly from the Philippines. And those domestic workers would actually be supporting were they allowed in at the moment, because all flights in and actually even transitions through Hong Kong are actually currently banned. So it seems ironic talking about moving and staying when COVID-19 and the global pandemic has almost immobilized large numbers of the world's population. Movements are now risk assessed, the body's fluids are tested to determine if one is a carrier or not, and the easy movement that had come to characterize the pre-pandemic world for some has been stopped in its tracks. And yet who gets to move and who stays was the story of the pandemic. The wealthy hired personal jets for a weekend, £25,000 cost of the hire, and flew from private airports. The less well-off and the very unwell found themselves immobilized inside homes, rooms, compounds, quarantine centres, neighbourhoods or cities. But other movements continued. Refugees mortgaged their past and their futures, and quite literally stepped into flimsy boats and hoped to make it to the other side. If they happened to be picked up by the authorities and detained, they found themselves immobilized in new ways, literally waiting for the officials to decide their fate and their future. And just as an interesting aside, in Australia, and Djokovic, the tennis player, who was detained and eventually, after several court hearings, returned back to Serbia. The first detainment accommodation he found himself in was actually an accommodation centre that at the moment and continues to hold a whole range of asylum-seeking families who've actually been holed up in that accommodation for 8 years, and it seemed exactly not just paradoxical, but the fact that Djokovic could actually mobilise very significant resources to have his case heard very rapidly when some of these detainees have been waiting years and years for their cases to actually be heard. The pandemic has done much to disturb the fetishising of the mobilities turn that has characterised the last 3 decades. The pandemic, of course, became the pandemic, however, because of the hypermobility of the cosmopolitan elites and their movements from continent to continent, city to city. And it was no accident, for example, that cities, Chinese cities linked to London, so these were the cosmopolitan cities of the world that were the kind of super spreader spaces that enabled the rapid movement of COVID-19 around the world. Beginning in the 1990s, a range of spatial metaphors emerged, from flows to liquid modernity and tipping points, which simultaneously propelled and sought to capture the zeitgeist of an era or of an epoch of accelerated movements and disruptions of ideas, capital, people, information. Apart from the ideological, legal and regulatory shifts that emerged at the time to enhance mobility, that would include, fast track lanes at airports. It would include buying yourself for a tariff or a special price, the right to belong to one queue that got you on and out faster, quicker, and so on. Movement and being mobile and being rapidly mobile was essentially the discourse, has been the discourse until the 2020, pre-pandemic, that enabled people and ideas to travel at enhanced speed across space. These were non-places of supermodernity. If we look at some of the great, huge airports that at the moment actually stand fairly silent as almost a kind of a litmus of that, the last 3 decades of parked planes, and essentially whole kind of sectors and industries that quite simply have become kind of stopped in its tracks. Mobility was all the rage in the academy too, and there are a few signs that we've shifted beyond it. In a discussion with my next employer, the University of Monash, that of course has got campuses around the world. My question to the Dean earlier on in the week is, what's Monash doing about the mobility promise? It's going to continue moving students and offer the promise of a mobility passport as part of the so-called Monash offer to the students. And so you can see universities again gearing up in all corners of the globe, who are gearing up again to rescope, replan and re-advertise mobility programs as an essential component of the academics and students' learning experience, while governments and regional bodies around the world are very likely continuing to promote mobility as crucial to learning in the new global economy. The world was on the move beginning in the 1990s and kind of reaches a peak, and we'll look at some figures here. And essentially these are, you know, large movements of either students or academics immigrating, tied to knowledge economy projects. If we look at the United States, for example, many of the graduate students were actually recruits out of to actually feed the US knowledge economy, came from India and China specifically. And again, it's quite likely that there'll be an outflow. Again, there's certainly an outflow from Hong Kong of those seeking employment elsewhere, and the decline, there's not only a declining population in Hong Kong, but there's a decline in the number of individuals who also want to work there. There's also a fairly significant decline on, you know, populations who had seen Hong Kong as its home, but of course, with the close developments with mainland China, things are much more problematic in Hong Kong. In a sign in the early 2000s that Europe was willing to use a wide variety of rationales for enhancing mobility beyond the programs that they had put into place in the 1980s, the European Commission through the early 2000s spent laying the groundwork for a new freedom, the movement of knowledge. And in the words of the EU Commissioner at the time, Europe is built on the four freedoms of goods, services, capital, and people. So add to this knowledge. The knowledge society of tomorrow needs the freedom of movement of knowledge. But of course, as Etienne Balabar will tell you, not everyone gets to move, and even right across Europe, despite the various countries across Europe, different countries as part of the European project, not the UK now, as it's removed itself, would actually have different levels of permissions in order to move across those spaces. Being detained on trains, being asked to show on a train your right to either be in Europe or to be moving across Europe, and so on. In 2009, the Council of the European Union placed mobility at the top of the strategic objectives for education and training. And of course, mobility is important for the European project because, in a sense, what it's also trying to do is unleash a kind of a national imaginary and promote a European imaginary, a commitment to the idea of being a European citizen as opposed to a citizen of the nation. And nation building, of course, had actually characterized the political projects of nation building and nation state making, which again, a supranational project like the European project would kind of crash into it in ways in which it would potentially challenge which mode or node of the state actually determines movement across nation state spaces. Removing itself through the Brexit process for sure has actually given the UK government a right to say who comes and who goes, and it's certainly done that with the exit, or the many migrants who actually return back to various parts, particularly Eastern Europe. And the hostilities that began to emerge if we think of the Brexit vote, and in the immediate aftermath of the Brexit vote here in the UK, the unleashing of racisms and so on. Academic mobility was not just a European phenomenon. Right across the Asian region, we've seen pilot mobility schemes, not just launched in the early 2000s, but a quick look at projects, for example, like ASEAN, are actually dependent on and do promote mobility across the region. So the movements of labour, people, ideas, and so on, attempting to also stitch together an Asian imaginary. And of course, these kinds of projects and the movements of students, academics, other kinds of labour and so on, is to some, it's a political and economic project as they gather themselves together and look at how they counter falling birth rates, for example, the rise of China, creation of blocks that enable one to, across the Asian region, to potentially kind of withstand the rise of mainland China and the strength of its economy, but for sure the absolute size of China and India as well. In the United States, on the other hand, there's been a ramping up until more recently of study abroad programs that were part of a curricula. But of course, what's also happening here as part of these study abroads is the possibilities of leaving for good. You move, you enjoy the new place you arrive at, you find yourself enmeshed in social relations and think differently about what it would mean to stay and to stay or to return. And certainly that's part of the strategy fundamentally as part of the visa systems, how to, for Australia particularly, but also Canada, how to enable you to retain those who've actually paid for their education to actually feed the so-called knowledge-based economy. The outcomes, in fact, actually, and until the pandemic, what was really interesting about the flows of students was that for the first time, I think, was it China, that was the fourth most important destination, one of the fourth most important destinations. And you saw the rise of US students actually turning up in China as they were kind of navigating and negotiating and strategizing their own futures in relation to where the jobs and job growth and so on actually happened to be. And so actually across the various Chinese campuses, you would actually see not just international professors being brought in to boost the rankings of Chinese universities, but increasingly students from Africa, from the United States, and from around that region, seeing China and Chinese universities and Chinese scholarships as potentially important as a way of thinking differently about the geopolitics of that region. The outcomes of some mobility schemes are often understated, a strategy and sensibility that is represented as leading to understanding and enhanced cooperation. But as Julia has remarked in her opening remarks, there's a very kind of hard, realist kind of political economy here as nations and governments around the world are actually thinking about how do they actually boost their economy and their economic development strategies. And most certainly Australia has done as it sought to use levels of attractiveness for not just arriving, but staying and actually joining the labour market. Singapore too, tiny little Singapore, nevertheless has significantly boosted its attractiveness to mainland China, to have mainland Chinese students turn up in Singapore, and the fees actually, the cost of fees actually significantly reduced if they stay beyond 4 years. And these have had major implications for places like Singapore, where there's rising antagonisms across the different social groups, particularly to do with some of the challenges to do with the labour market. So let me just make a few remarks around researching mobilities. It's interesting, isn't it, that and this would be the late John Ury, who died more recently with Mimi Scheller, developed the Mobilities journal, which might be actually one of the journals that you might think about also for some of the papers that are being presented at the conference. But mobility was an evocative keyword for the 21st century, a fashionable slogan that has kind of faded more recently, but I have no doubt because of the dependence on movement, from airlines to universities to economies like Australia, New Zealand and so on, that have actually fundamentally structurally depended upon movements of brains from one part of the world and bodies into other parts of the world. Such developments led social theorists like John Urien and Scheller to argue that mobility projects were generating deep changes in social formations. However, as writers like Fahy and Kenway went on to argue, how we research and understand mobility as an object of intellectual inquiry, just as you're doing with problematizing emigration, who doesn't get to go, has been much slower off the mark. The Mobilities Journal was launched in 2006, and its editorial call to think of different kinds of research that might inform the mobility turn has actually been really important. And as Kenway and Fahy kind of note here, there's the framing of mobility, of emigration, of migration, or immigration and migration, has often been dogged by a very linear understanding of the direction of movement, as in brain drain, brain gain, and framings of skill migration. But of course, that's making assumptions about bodies, but of course, brains aren't necessarily fixed in places. And what we've seen with the globalized economy is, let's say, health data can be collected here, find its way to India, get read overnight and get sent back. So labouring is actually taking place virtually, and that speaks very directly, I think, to the kind of work that Julia was talking about, that she's involved in. But what we still do have are neoclassical accounts of knowledge being moved, more or less as in the sense of human capital. The spatiality of movement is more or less kind of thought about, partly to do with the fact that borders and the policing of borders is to some extent, but not completely, something that nation states do. But if we go back to my earlier example of Western Australia, you can't move across the boundary from West Australia to South Australia in Australia at the moment, because the internal state boundary there is actually policed by the, not the national government, but by the provincial or the state governments, as they would describe themselves, so the subnational governments here. And so there's very interesting ways in which we can see that the nation state bordering practices are actually being challenged by subnational bordering practices at the current time. But we also have to think too about the sociality of movement. As, is it a good thing for everyone? Because it comes here, it comes with notions of cosmopolitanism, but who doesn't get to move here? Who gets left behind? And this even includes who would find it difficult to move as part of the academy's projects. And a simple example here would be in the case of kind of pre-pandemic Switzerland. There's more or less a requirement to move amongst academics in order to get promotion. And if you're kind of the social relations that you're caught up in to do with family and caring, possibly to careers and so on, as research in this area shows, women are actually detrimentally affected. But at the same time, students, and here the examples for me would actually be Denmark, Spain. Is very difficult for young Spanish scholars prior to the pandemic to actually get jobs in that academy unless they'd actually demonstrated a period of mobility outside of Spain. In part, this is to do with acquiring English as and being fluent in English, and so many of these Spanish students would actually get scholarships from the Spanish government and find their way to an academic institution and acquire a period of mobility that enabled their careers to now become mobile. So it kind of frees up the possibility of job applications and so on. So what are we to make of mobility as a social and political project, for example, in the academy, as a way of thinking about wider transformations in the spatial, infrastructural and institutional moorings that configure and enable mobilities? And here, what I want to do is just reflect on three things that might be potentially helpful for for the discussions over the 2 days of the conference. One is actually the conceptual language, and here it'd be really interesting, partly in some of the framings of the special issues, but also in your own conversations of opening up mobilities to a more critical investigation to do with movement as beyond, and this is fairly kind of standard now, but beyond the zero-sum linear approaches to movement as migration, and to human capital and nation state accounts of the implications of these, the things I've just mentioned. Some of the language for sure turned on questions of gain and circulation through movements backward and forward via remittances, networks, and other forms of knowledge exchange. But you can see right at the moment, again, the discussion is on the table where there's not enough teachers actually being produced in the United Kingdom, and the easy way in which the UK would potentially look at some of the places like South Africa and begin to look at English speaking, but teachers in other parts of the world who might well have been invested in their training by the state, but actually being poached now by other countries, and not an easy way of actually paying back those other countries for the costs of the investments. What Fahy and Kenway's work seeks to do is avoid some of the epistemological traps by thinking of maybe some of these subjects as active agents negotiating, interpreting, and contesting their social worlds by mobilizing and materializing knowledges and knowledges, because bodies are moving with knowledges, of course, and knowledges are mediated by language and languages. And of course, across the European space, that tendency to go toward English as a language of instruction has been quite noticeable, and what it's actually doing there is placing limits then on teaching in the so-called national language across many of the European countries. Fahy and Kenway's work tends to think of empires of knowledge and edges of empires, and that actually enables us to think rather differently about which movements get enabled, and of course this privileges, for example, the empires of knowledge, because what's actually moving as students, let's say, move to the United Kingdom or to the United States is there are knowledge systems that are both being acquired, but also being moved back to the edges of those empires. And if you have any doubt, it's just even worth looking at what the flows are to the empires of knowledge, Chinese, large numbers, Indian, and so on. And then the movements back of those kinds of knowledge is the kind of project that Gominda Bamra is quite critical of. Because what it does is it actually reinforces old colonial and imperial projects here in terms of the movements, not only of intellectuals, but also of students and those who choose to, who might remain and remain with their families. So for Hannam then, it's not a question of privileging the mobile subject, but rather the tracking of power and politics, or the power and politics of discourses and practices of mobility, creating both movement and status. What Fahy and Kenway's conceptual work does to this tracking is a way of framing and focusing upon academics and movements within the academy, and what that actually does to knowledge production. Academic mobility can also then be regarded as a resource, just in the examples that I was using there. The kind of work that Tony Welsh has been doing, thinking about potentially the attractiveness for Chinese scholars to study, and many studies, Martin Carnoy's work too. Some of the Latin American countries sending up their academics to acquire English and often access to laboratories and so on. There were projects that were unleashed by countries, Chile, Mexico, Australia, and promoted by the World Bank to better understand, if you brought back some of your successful intellectuals back to Chile to Mexico and so on, could you not bring them back? And certainly Australia and New Zealand did this too. Could you not bring your successful intellectuals back to work for the purposes of the national economy project? And I certainly personally was approached, flattered at one level, to consider a movement back to Australia, to make a commitment to the national project rather than to intellectual projects and knowledge production in the centre of the empire, which is where I happened to be at the time, and at the University of Bristol. And so what we do see is these circulations of knowledges that in the case of China would include bringing Western intellectuals in with their particular kind of framings of knowledge, English as a language, the publications that they put their work into, that would actually, to some extent, contest both social ontologies important in China, notions of all under heaven and so on, with Western ontologies. It's certainly been very problematic in the case of New Zealand and the indigenous Māori, who've seen the movement in of large populations from the Pacifica world, the Oceania and Pacific world, that to some extent knocks their indigenous bicultural and bicultural project kind of sideways, and seeing actually even some of their Pacifica populations, the Pacifica populations, as also part of a form of imperialism. Let me just make a couple more remarks so that around this notion of knowledge, because these bodies are they are circulating, and transnational mobility as a resource has value and counts in negotiating academic careers. It for sure actually frees up mobility for particular individuals, but that wouldn't be the same for every academic either wanting to leave. As the world spiraled out of control on in relation to September 11, and whole populations from parts of the world became themselves problematized. A colleague of mine who was an academic with Iranian background found all of his emails being constantly interrupted and his mail being interrupted by the Canadian government. A name like Sahib Pato was regarded in Canada at the time, despite having lived there for several decades, as problematic by the Canadian government in a context of suspicions and so on. Lehman's work insists we view mobility not as a social experience whose value is neutral, but as an experience that has value because it can be drawn into fields of asymmetrical gendered relations and thus reproduce male power. And Lehman's work here is thinking explicitly around the case of Switzerland and the demand actually that there's a mobility experience, much as the example I used earlier of Spain. So I want to just reflect finally on an ethics of mobility, because of course academic mobility is very, very different to the immobilizing that's actually happening for asylum seekers. But of course you can actually be an asylum seeker and either an academic, or in the anecdotal case I'm going to give you, a PhD student that I was supervising who Syrian, was actually experiencing visually the imploding of Syria and the city that she'd actually grown up in, Damascus. And she actually kind of hit the kind of insensitivity of the academy, where her progress to keep her visa alive demanded that in fact she was sufficiently mentally well to continue with her studies. But she found herself without any resource because her scholarship money had been cut off. She found her family kind of dispersed between Dubai and places like Lebanon or Beirut. She found herself not able to access resources in the university, in this case, the University of Bristol, because it had no way of dealing with the fact that it itself might be potentially kind of responsible for a student who finds themselves more or less not quite stateless, but essentially resourceless, but to some extent definitely no longer able to assume A, the resource, but B, the place she'd actually come from was a place she could actually return to. Finally, my final reflection then is on the ethics of mobility. Fahey and Kenway point to a little raised issue, but for sure has emerged with the pandemic. When we don't move, we are not feeding the travel industry. When we don't move, we're not producing the pollution that has created a climate crisis. And the way, of course, that the Commission has actually dealt with that has been to look and explore what it calls virtual mobility projects that keep the idea of the European university alive, but actually we're bodies, but it's only the ideas actually moving. That will be really interesting. It's put quite a few million euros actually into opportunities for European universities to come together and be part of specific European university projects. And that will be a really interesting one to follow, because of course the movement of a body and the social relations that happen are very different from the movement of ideas and the sharing of ideas and the bodies actually remaining. Fahey and Kenway ask us to think through the complex politics of arrivals, departures and responsibilities that mobility entails. It is an ethic that is clearly of concern to many studies, and I'm sure it'll be raised over the course of the conference today, that mobility actually enables certain possibilities, but it also heightens other forms of racisms and so on. The stranger that actually finds themselves unable to read new cultures, isolated because they're from somewhere else. Racism and depends on where one comes from in terms of the empire of knowledge. There is then much work to be done, and it's just wonderful to see this conference underway and the discussions that you're to have. So hand in hand with a program of research, as today and the conference tomorrow will actually reveal, is that the empirical work that you're actually doing, the theoretical and empirical work, actually significantly adds value to how we think about the questions of who comes and who stays. And so I'd like to leave it there and to thank you all for your attention, and very happy to look forward to questions. So thank you very much, Julia.